questions for you and your book. Pascal, go for it.
Yes, Matt Conrad McManus. I enjoyed your book. First of all, congratulations on your book,
Thanks, buddy.
2024 copyright, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of when it was set to come out. But I had the first question I really would like you to do, if you can, for our audience, because your book is so comprehensive. Can you trace the philosophical origin of the contemporary extreme right, going back in a timeline to its Aristotelian origins, to its Nietzschean origins, Burkean origins, and explain how they actually coalesce in terms of ideology? I know that's a big question, but I know you can handle it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's really what the book is setting out to talk about, right? So, what I do at the very beginning of the book is I try to lay out my typology. And one of the key questions in the book, of course, is what does it mean to be on the right? How do we say that somebody like, say, James Stevens or James Bush is on the right? Or sorry, or George Bush, and so is Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, all that stuff. It's a tough question. And what I argue is that actually F.A. Hayek got the diagnosis of what it means to be on the right correct. Not often that I say that, but it's true. Where he says that to be on the right is to be committed to this idea that there are recognizably superior or demonstrably superior people in a society. And these demonstrably superior people are entitled to more or less everything, right? More power, more status, certainly more political influence. And one of the biggest problems in our society, from the standpoint of the political right, are egalitarian movements focused on equality that say, no, actually, there aren't recognizably superior people, or even if there are people who are better at this or better than that, it doesn't matter that their lives go any better than everyone else's. And of course, everyone on the right has a different vision of what it means to be a so-called recognizably superior person, and that really frames the conception of society and the conception of politics that they'll adopt. So, you brought up Edmund Burke. For Edmund Burke, recognizably superior people are supposed to be set by traditions, right? And this is why he'll defend the aristocracy, which he sees as embodying certain kind of virtues and characteristics that are necessary for the preservation of the ancient regimes of Europe at the time. But you can flash forward, and Nietzsche has a very different conception of what a recognizably superior person is. Also aristocratic, but his aristocracy is supposed to be newer, tougher, and more cruel in a lot of ways than the older aristocracy. Because Nietzsche thinks that the old aristocracy, including people of his own era, like Otto von Bismarck, were just completely incapable of holding back the tide of egalitarian and especially socialist reform in Germany. So, you needed tougher people in order to accomplish that. The list goes on and on and on. But if you scratch it very far beneath the surface, I would argue that this is the kind of fundamental inclination that you'll see that makes someone right wing.
That's a fascinating conclusion, that the belief in almost kind of, I wouldn't say genetic, but a natural hierarchy based on the betterness of your humanity and superiority of others is fascinating. One of the things you highlight in your book that I was interested in, I think it's actually in the foreword, is that
Mhm.
particularly the Nietzschean manifestation of this conservative ideology is connected to the belief that Christianity weakened Western civilization. All right? In other words, Nietzsche's idea is that the Christian notion of that we are all equal and one before God, and the only better than the other is in righteous deeds. He argues that that kind of egalitarian messaging, which we know goes back to the adoption of Christianity by the Europeans with the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD and so on and so forth, that the adoption of Christianity by the Roman Empire is the beginning of the fall of Western civilization. Can you discuss that for us, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is one of the most controversial things that I talk about because a lot of people like Nietzsche. And whenever I get angry emails about this, I always write back and I'm like, hey, listen, I'm interested in Nietzsche also. I had a whole essay collection on him. He's a big part of this book. I'm not sitting there trying to cancel Nietzsche or anything, but let's be clear on what Nietzsche actually believed, right? Nietzsche was fundamentally opposed to the left with every fiber of his being. Nietzsche even said that he wasn't an individualist, which he's often characterized as in The Will to Power, because he says individualists are concerned with everyone's flourishing. My philosophy is concerned with what he called rank ordering, right? Ordering people according to their rankings. And later on, in a letter with a Danish fan, essentially, his thinking was characterized as aristocratic radicalism. And Nietzsche responded saying, "This is a delightful or very good way of characterizing what I'm thinking about." So, what does aristocratic radicalism mean for Nietzsche? Aristocratic radicalism means overturning what he sees as the millennia-long corrosion that Christianity and Christian ethics has wrought in Western civilization. And that's a complicated thing for him, and I'm not going to be able to summarize it in all of its riches here. But he basically says, look, Christianity emerged out of a slave morality, the morality of the subordinate classes, and sometimes they'll reconnote this in a racial way. Also, I mean, Nietzsche wasn't above racism, not at all. And he'll say, listen, the slave class would look up on the masters and covet their power and covet their status. But they weren't brave enough to actually overcome the masters because that would involve violence and put their life at risk. So instead, what they did was something remarkable. They took their feelings of envy and they took their feelings of ressentiment and they creatively turned them into slave morality, right? And slave morality basically inverted the moral system of the masters, where the masters said, you should be proud and wealthy and successful. The slaves said, you should be humble, forgiving, and look after the least among us, because it's the least among us that are the children of God. And over time, this became attached to various kinds of Christian metaphysics, especially drawing very heavily from Plato, and became the kind of foundational way of looking at things in the Western world from a moral standpoint. And Nietzsche says this goes through a lot of different evolutions over time. But ultimately, liberalism, socialism, democracy, anti abolitionism, also, all of these aren't breaks from Christianity. They're the secularized forms that Christianity takes in a kind of post God world. Since what's occurred with people like Kant or with Marx or with John Stuart Mills is all these people say we can't have Christian metaphysics anymore. We can't believe in, a great God in the sky that ordains that all people are equal under his throne. But we can still hold on to the essence of Christian morality, this idea that all people are equal by nature, or all people are equal, deontologically in terms of their rights, or all people need to be factored equally into utilitarian calculations. And Nietzsche again says we need to chuck this whole notion of equality, reject what he calls the lie of equality of souls, and turn to a more aristocratically radical kind of system that ranks people according to, well, Nietzsche's own personal preferences, which are very extreme.
I mean, one of the things that I really found fascinating is that, like, Nietzsche coming out of Germany and coming out of these countries that were all basically dominated and pillaged by the Roman Empire. I was like, is he aware of like how the Romans looked at these inferior? It doesn't seem like his calculation of European history. Forget about the history of the other, brown people of the world, but how in European history, like this notion was used to impose, oppression on most Europeans during the Roman Empire. The idea that the superior people and all this other stuff. But I think that as twisted as Nietzsche is, I mean, one of the things I found fascinating that you elucidated in your book as well is that his definition of success is a civilizational view, in that what defines success is the societal ability to create a society or civilization that has institutions that live for millennia to be marveled upon. For example, the book talks about the Egyptians. In other words, Nietzsche is saying is that if we don't live in a civilization that can create things like the Egyptians or the Romans or the Greeks, we're not worth living as human beings. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Nietzsche probably talks about this most extensively in Beyond Good and Evil, right, where he summarizes his view of an ideal society. And he lays out his way of evaluating what makes a good society and what makes a bad society, particularly in the middle of the book. And he says, listen, a great culture or a great civilization or a great society is one that accomplishes extraordinary things. But he says we know what needs to go into a great society that will accomplish extraordinary things. It needs to be a society where the aristocracy is given tremendous amounts of power and tremendous amounts of liberty to do whatever it needs to do, right? And that's also going to require them to actively oppress the lower orders because that will allow them to have more leisure time so that they can pursue these kind of more higher order activities. And also because the slave class might be necessary as a kind of clay that can be molded by the superior person, including through violence, in order to execute their extraordinary projects. And again, Nietzsche is not above defending slavery in very emphatic terms in order to advance this kind of position. So, for instance, in both The Antichrist and in Twilight of the Idols, he talks about, listen, the biggest problem with Germany right now is Otto von Bismarck, famous progressive that he is trying to give the lower orders a certain degree of education so that they can more effectively participate in German politics, more effectively, fulfill their roles in an industrial society. And Nietzsche says that's ridiculous and stupid. You should be educating the lower orders of German society to be a slave class. And if you don't educate them to be a slave class, why are you surprised that all of a sudden many working class Germans are deciding that they want to vote for the Socialist Party of Germany? Because of course they are, right? So don't bother with that. Let the slaves be the slaves and let the lords be the lords. And it's an extraordinarily radical view, but one that he thinks is necessary in order to produce the kind of grandiose and exemplary societies and exemplary cultures that he sees as necessary in order to affirm life politically.